Hello YouTube. Let's talk about some very interesting cases that took place in the Soviet Union, and I want to thank you, all of you who leave me your comments and suggestions. It's very helpful, and I hope to respond to all of them. Given the time, I will do it. But those are very interesting cases that I want to talk about simply because they pertain to the question whether UFOs can actually harm human beings. The first case took place in 1983. Location was military unit number 02427. It was located in the village of Luch in the Nikolaev region of Ukraine, USSR. And the facility involved was the optical observation point of the Air Defense Forces, outer space controlled by radar, and the purpose was for tracking artificial Earth satellites. So during his military service in 1982-1983 in the village of Luch, Private Komov of the Soviet Armed Forces was an observer-operator of foreign reconnaissance satellites at the visual detection point. On the territory of the military unit, there was a platform with 12 optical theodolites, with cameras that were used at night and in clear weather. There was also a vertical rectangular ink-light antenna and a link broadcasting unit, which served as a jammer. In the mid-1960s, near Nikolaev, Ukraine, the construction of a working prototype of an over-horizon short-wave radar, it was known as Product 5H77, under the code Duga, it was started. And it was developed at the Research Institute for Long-Range Radio Communication. An over-the-horizon radar station was intended to test the possibility of detecting intercontinental ballistic missiles by their starting torch, working on the basis of reflection of the radio signal from the ionosphere. The station provided coverage of China's airspace, so the adversary for the Union of Soviet Socialist Republic Armed Forces to spy on was the People's Republic of China, another communist state. The transmitting antenna was located in the village of Luch, halfway along the Nikolaev-Kherson highway, and was clearly visible near the village of Posad-Pokrovskaya. Very beautiful area, by the way, if you ever get to travel in Ukraine. Now, the receiving antenna was located near the village Kalinovka, close to Nikolaev. The distance between the antenna was about 50 to 60 kilometers. The radiation power of the antennas was so high that the metal structures worked as receivers and, so to say, talked, and could also be harmful to health. During the service in 1983, Alexander had the opportunity to observe a UFO once, and also hear from the colleagues in the barracks about repeated observations of unidentified objects above the military unit. Remember it, they talked among themselves, but it doesn't mean they talked to anybody else, because there was a punishment to pay. Anyway, in January-February of 1983, while practicing after training on the detection and tracking of space objects, Alexander was at the watch point of visual detection, watch post of visual detection. At the optical observation point, information was received from Moscow about the place and time of flight of reconnaissance satellite for its fixation on the camera and confirmation of the orbit parameters. So they had to follow, track it, register, do everything they needed to do. Around 0:10 hours, Alexander noticed the satellite, and having caught it in the theodolite's lens, made about 7 frames of visual photography. At the end of the observation, he decided to move away in order to enter the observation parameters into the log. But the soldier did not have a chance to, because in the sky at 0:13 hours, he noticed the appearance of bright flash and the passage of a radiant or luminous UFO at the velocity of 100 kilometers per hour in a straight line at an altitude of about 3 kilometers. When theodolite was pointing at it, Alexander saw an elliptical golden UFO hurl about 10 meters, with portholes at the equator from which came out a whitish light of milky color. At the time of the observation, 3-4 frames of visual photography were actually taken. Now, after 7 seconds, the UFO stopped and hovered and began to double in size while descending and increasing brightness. Due to the strong brightness of the light source, that being the UFO, dark filters were used. Alexander began to call out his colleagues, but after 8 seconds of descent, the UFO was gone. That is, the brightness or radiance disappeared. Arriving officers had only his report of observation. So after hearing the eyewitness, they did not believe him, but the camera with the film was taken away for inspection, confiscated. He recorded his observation in a special journal. And this is what happened afterwards. While in his outfit in the military unit's kitchen at noon on March 1st, 1983, Alexander lost consciousness until there was no heartbeat for 13 minutes. 2 days earlier, he had been severely beaten by his fellow soldiers because he had interceded due to abusive treatment of one soldier by others. So, on March 1st, other soldiers discovered and pumped out Alexander, and he was transferred from the dining room to the local dispensary, where an IV was installed. Alexander woke up a few days later, and having regained consciousness, found out from his colleagues who visited him that while he was in a coma, he missed the manifestation of a similar UFO, just like the one he observed before. According to the soldiers, on the day of the incident in the kitchen between 23:15 and 00 hours in the evening, the illumination went out in the military unit. There was no light. Venturing to the street, the military personnel discovered a luminous spherical object of frosted color hovering over the barracks. After it hovered for undetermined time, the UFO disappeared. It just flew away. After its disappearance, the illumination returned. The lights, the lighting. The lack of electrical power had affected the performance of nearby radar antennas. Once in the hospital in Nikolaev, Alexander was again visited by colleagues who claimed that in mid-March of 1983 they again recorded the manifestation of identical UFOs over the military unit with the blackout. Lights went out. Also, the eyewitnesses were visited by the General Commission from Moscow and asked questions about their observation of UFOs. It was assumed that Alexander's comatose condition and the appearance of UFOs could be connected in some way, as before the March 1st incident, there were no manifestations of anomalous objects. So soldiers just kept their mouths shut about everything that happened before. After undergoing a medical examination, tomography, he was commissioned in Kalinovka. Alexander signed a non-disclosure agreement for 7 years. Since the military unit was secret, the communication between the soldiers about this anomalous subject was strictly classified by their officers, and soldiers could be called for explanations to the headquarters. Military correspondence was also checked and probably censored, as they did in other cases. So, did the UFO harm Soviet soldiers in 1983? There are a number of other cases I could refer to. Cases of possible harm due to encounters with UFOs in the USSR. But the only additional one I want to describe today took place in 1968. Yuri Gagarin conquered space, but was killed during a routine training flight. However, his passing is shrouded in mystery and raising many questions and generating a number of theories. Yuri Gagarin achieved legendary status when he became the first person to blast into space on April the 12th, 1961. He left our planet an ordinary pilot, and he returned like an icon. In the Soviet Union, he was worshipped like a rock star, and he was his nation's hero. We all loved him. I remember it, because he brought glory to the Soviet Union. We were the first ones in space. The morning of March 27, 1968, during a routine training flight on a training jet, MiG, the first cosmonaut of our planet, Yuri Gagarin, and pilot instructor Colonel Vladimir Serogin were killed. According to the planned schedule on March 27, 1968, Yuri Gagarin, under the control of pilot instructor Serogin, was to perform a control flight on MiG-15 UTI, meaning training aircraft, in the area at an altitude of 4,200 meters. It is well known that the crew took off at 10:19 a.m. and after 7 minutes began to perform the exercise, which lasted at least 20 minutes. However, after 4 minutes, Gagarin reported that the exercise had been completed and requested permission to return to the base. The flight manager gave permission, although he did not find out the reason for the premature termination of the flight. Then it was determined that 68 seconds after the last communication, the MiG-15 UTI number 18 crashed into Earth, into the ground, and the crew perished. A government commission had been set up to determine the cause of the crash. However, it did not reach a consensus and did not release any official opinion. In this regard, in the following years, a lot of private research was carried out, and many versions of the causes of the tragedy were proposed, but unfortunately none of them clearly answer all the objective information that was received about the flight and its final stage. It was impossible to assess the objectivity of the Commission's work, as all working materials were classified and became inaccessible, and the collected remains of the crashed aircraft were packed and hidden in perpetual storage. It was not mentioned as to why they were removed from further, more thorough research. Most likely this was the only unseemly goal: concealment of the real circumstances and causes that led to the disaster. For the first time, some of the results of the Commission investigation were published in a free statement, meaning uncensored, only 19 years later in Pravda newspaper on March 23, 1987. In the article, they were missing 2 seconds. And also in the magazine called Nauka и Жизнь, or Science and Life, number 5, issue 1987, and it was titled The Last Flight. The authors of the articles, Professor Sergei Belotsarkovsky and pilot cosmonaut of the USSR Alexei Leonov, reported that the basis of the decision on the causes of the disaster, the Commission adopted the version that explained the crash as the result of putting the plane in a corkscrew while performing a sharp maneuver by the crew for some unknown reason. It was also alleged that after the corkscrew, the crew was fully operational and acted correctly, assuming that it had sufficient altitude reserve. And only the mistake of the altimeter at 200-300 meters led to the fact that the plane with a steep dive came out of the clouds at an altitude of only 400 to 600 meters, at which it was impossible to avoid crashing into the ground. None of the versions, however, had any objective evidence, and while many members of the Commission disagreed with this explanation of the cause of the tragic consequences, the Commission insisted on accepting its proposals. According to the Commission member Professor Nikolai Lysenko, the investigation itself was shrouded in incomprehensible secrecy. The results were not the property of all the participants in the investigation. As a result, despite the thoroughness and depth of research in all areas, the Commission's activities were never completed. And most importantly, according to Professor Bela-Tsarkovsky, the Commission could not, without exception, study and summarize all the materials of the working groups. Therefore, the conclusion of the government, it was the resolution of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union and the Council of Ministers of November 28, 1968, number 932-331, was made on the basis of what the Commission issued, covering up its inactivity. The most likely cause of the death of Gagarin and Seryogin was a sharp turn of the plane in order to avoid a collision with a probe sphere. The less likely reason was the plane's turn away from the top edge of the clouds. As a result of the sharp turn away, the plane went to the critical corners of the flight. The difficult weather conditions made it difficult to control the aircraft, and the crew died. It is no coincidence that Professor Bela-Tsarkovsky was forced to make a conclusion on this occasion. Something out of the ordinary happened here. However, we still do not have a clear picture of this incident. No version except, and then it says, is in accordance with the original data. Okay? And what is that except? What did Bela-Tsarkovsky, who seemingly reasonably calculated the flight path of the plane at the last minute and claimed that the crew competently tried to get out of the corkscrew and almost achieved it? What did he mean? What was not said? Perhaps the deputy regiment commander, Lieutenant Colonel Vladimir Tkachenko, made it clearer about all this case. In 22 years, no one has been able to come up with even the most insane version of the cause of the disaster, generalizing contradictory facts. Everything from air hooliganism to an encounter with UFOs was analyzed. No, I rule out the first version completely. There were no failures on the part of the equipment either, that's for sure. And only the latest version, no matter how exotic it may seem, gives only the hint of the truth. So he talked about UFOs. Where did this version come from? Were there any grounds to say so? What evidence proved that there was another reason, as was called the exotic, rather than the one that Commission indicated? It turns out that there were a number of events, the explanation of which could be connected only with the assumptions of Bela-Tsarkovsky and Tkachenko. 1. According to the pilot of the first class, Colonel Alexander Sruvtsev, there were no corkscrew at the last minute of the flight. When impact with the ground, the engine did about 11,000 revolutions per minute, and this is typical for the horizontal flight. When entering the corkscrew maneuver, the pilot immediately reduces engine revolutions. It was not done here. Apparently, the tragic event took place even during the horizontal flight, and after the event, the crew was not able to normally pilot the aircraft. In addition, the plane crashes at the speed of 100-150 kilometers per hour. Here, the speed in the collision with the ground was about 900 kilometers per hour. 2. No right side wing anti-flutter device was found at the crash site, as well as more than half of the glazing of the pilot's cockpit lantern was not found. This could have been the result of partial destruction of the aircraft while still in flight, due to some force impact on it. As a result, the crew lost consciousness, perhaps temporarily, and the flight of the aircraft before the impact with the ground was uncontrollable. Moreover, the tragic event occurred suddenly and instantly, as evidenced by the blood test of pilots, normal level of adrenaline. Soviet cosmonaut German Titov, who worked in one of the subcommissions, repeatedly insisted on the need to explain these facts, but the commission did not accept them for consideration. 3. The fact that there was a force impact on the airplane in the air, said pilot cosmonaut Pavel Vinogradov in an interview with the Ukrainian newspaper Boulevard Gardona in March of 2013. Here's what he said: the lantern in their cockpit was broken not by a blow to the ground, but during the flight on the outside, and a third of the wing console was found far from the crash site, indicating that it had broken off in flight. By the way, during the investigation, the commission never mentioned this fact. Never. Only once famous Soviet aviator Kamanin, on page 215 of his diary, wrote that 5 kilometers from the crash site, they found hatch from the photo film, a sign of the destruction of the aircraft in the air. He was with the commission too. So, destruction of the aircraft in the air. A group of expert pilots, which included esteemed test pilots Sidov, Ilyushin, and others, claimed that it is impossible to explain the movement of the aircraft and the flight dynamics calculated by the group by any conscious action of the crew. Such movement of the aircraft could most likely be due to the crew's temporary loss of performance in the air due to any impact on the crew. What happened to the aircraft in the air shows, and the identification of a number of elements of the aircraft design at a considerable distance, up to 800 meters from the crash site. 5. In the letter of cosmonauts Nikolaev, Popovich, Bykovsky, Titov, and Belyaev to the Secretary of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, Ustinov cited a number of factors that the Commission either ignored, for example, the absence of 62% of the glazing of cockpit lights and anti-flag system at the site of the disaster, or arbitrarily unproven the trees of the starboard side of the plane's fuselage, when in reality there were no trees to the right of the aircraft. Each of these factors altogether could indicate the impact of some destructive reason on the airplane before the last minute of the flight, which reason Belyatsarkovsky meant by the definition of that except, and Tkachenko called more definitely encounter with UFOs. In all likelihood, trying to leave the area of presence of an unusual object, Gagarin indeed stopped the early performance of the exercise, which was reported to the supervisor of flights. However, he could not avoid its forceful influence or impact. Most likely it was not the result of physical contact, as one can imagine, but was the result of the effects of a special form of energy emitted by the object at a distance, or by the plasma shell around the object, plasma shell around the UFO. In the practice of observations on unidentified objects of various forms, there have been many cases of such force-based energy contact when encountering aircraft, which usually led to paralyzing actions of pilots and aircraft crash as a result. Materials for the commission on the exotic version were presented by a working group headed by an experienced Soviet pilot, Colonel Anatoly Moisenko, who was tasked with identifying eyewitnesses of the tragedy among the local population. General Pushkin, deputy chairman of the government commission, he was in charge of the leadership. The team was assigned an Mi-2 helicopter and included a camera and voice recorder to record eyewitness accounts. One of the witnesses with whom Colonel Moisenko spoke was an employee of the nursery, which was located near the site of the Gagarin's airplane's demise. This witness said that at about 10:30 hours she heard some unusual clap or something similar to a clap. When she looked up, she saw a rolling plane which did not fly as usual, but somehow strangely was descending on her, falling down like silently. From the models of the shown aircraft, she did not hesitate to choose that model MiG aircraft. Thus it appeared that the unguided aircraft was falling with a broken engine. If this is true, it will become clear why there was no fire at the crash site, although there was still enough fuel in the tank. The fact that the engine did not work was later confirmed by an employee of the research department of the State Research Institute of the Air Force, Lieutenant Colonel Shulinsky, who took part in the investigation into the causes of the MiG-15 UTI's demise. When the MiG-15 number 18 came into contact with the ground, the absence of gas temperature in the jet pipe was determined. In addition, he said, witnesses told them that when the airplane crashed, there was no ordinary rumble, but only a whistling noise, and smoke did not come out from the aircraft. A further survey of local residents showed that all of them had seen a sudden glowing sphere in the air before the airplane crashed. This information was later confirmed by Vitaly Vorobyov, a researcher at the scientific enterprise Technologia and head of Omnink's ufology group, who also spoke with witnesses of this tragedy. Thus, Anna Yartseva, a resident of the city of Pokrovka, said that when she walked through the forest in the village of Voskresenskaya that morning, suddenly through the treetops just above her head, she saw a very bright globular blob of light, emitting white rays, as if another sun had shone. The woman rushed to escape in fear, but soon fell into the snow and covered her head with her hands. After a while she heard an explosion. It was only the next day that she learned that Yuri Gagarin had died not far from where she was. That's when she thought about a possible connection between a brightly glowing sphere and the disaster. Nikolai Osipov, a resident of the village of Zarechnoye in the Vladimir region, was working on forestry near the village of Novoselovo on the morning of March 27. Between 10 and 11 in the morning, over him, something flew in the sky. As he put it, some damn thing that was round and glowing like thousands of suns combined. Soon the silhouette of the aircraft flashed over the forest, and when it disappeared behind the trees, there was an explosion like a clap, and a cloud of smoke rose over the forest. At the same time, in the forest, there was a schoolboy from the village of Petrushka, Yura Semyonov, with his friend. They saw a glowing balloon over the forest, resembling a blimp, and watched with interest the flight of an object they had never seen before. Then there was the noise of a flying plane heading towards this balloon. They seemed to be about to collide, but this did not happen. The plane began to fall at a great angle, and cutting off the tops of the trees, crashed into the ground. there was a strong explosion, and a small fragment of the airplane fell down where the guys were recently standing. Yura's friend picked up the wreckage and took it home, and then handed it over to the commission. Not far from the crash site, there was a forester of the Kirzach district. He saw an airplane collide in the air with a large glowing sphere before falling to the ground. The evidence was also corroborated by other witnesses. One of them, for example, confidently said that at first he saw the airplane and then approaching with it an orange sphere. After that, the sphere merged with the airplane, flew off abruptly and dissolved. So was there a merger or a fusion? Maybe the remains of the airplane could tell about it. It is known from the practice of accident analysis that all objective information obtained during the investigation should be fully used in the evidence of the alleged causes. At the same time, any exceptions to any data required a good justification. Why do you make exceptions for something that was collected and testimonies? Therefore, the proof of the cause of the accident should cover all accepted information and correspond to all the circumstances and events that occurred at that time. But in the materials of the commission, nothing was said about the encounter of the aircraft with a brightly glowing sphere. Apparently, a member of the government commission, Professor, Doctor of Technical Sciences Nikolai Lysenko, was right when he wrote, "The investigation itself was covered with unexplained secrecy. The results were not shared by all participants in the investigation." Of course, if the commission officially recognized the fact of the collision of the aircraft with a glowing sphere in the air, it would have meant recognition of the real flights of unidentified flying objects in our airspace. This meant admitting that they actually existed, a fact that contradicted the overall scientific concept that the Academy of Sciences and the policy of the Communist Party's Central Committee. In 1968, it was officially believed, and you know what? Nothing has really changed, even if there is no Soviet Union. It was officially believed that there are no unidentified flying objects in the Soviet Union, and therefore there are no problems associated with them. I will stay off for a moment, and I'll tell you that when I started talking in the United States and presenting evidence about Soviet UFOs, I was attacked by debunkers. And I'll tell you a full story later, to the extent that they have been going. And I started wondering, a younger man at the time, why is it that I cannot speak about Soviet UFO cases in a free country? What is it that I say or bring forward scares government, paid, and other debunkers? Anyway, let's go back to the Soviet policies against UFO's existence. This was first pronounced in the solemn speech of one of the country's leaders on November 6, 1952, Pervukhin. He said that Americans, they have already gone mad. They are already seeing in the sky flying saucers and green fireballs. Now, this was said at the time when the KGB already had a folder with observations on unidentified flying objects in the Soviet Union. And after Stalin talked about this to his top Soviet scientists. At the same time, a group of enthusiasts led by Felix Ziegel, an associate professor of Moscow Aviation Institute, contributing to the influx of new research and bold ideas, they tried to prove the objectivity of the observed events and their connection with the phenomenon we have not yet identified. They were looking at UFO cases in the USSR. However, on January 8, 1961, Pravda newspaper published an article by the academician Artsimovich. It was titled "The Myth of Flying Saucers," which took a sharply negative position to this issue. The article stated there is not a single fact that indicates that mysterious material objects are flying over us. all the talk about it have the same original source: unscrupulous and anti-scientific information. It's time to put an end to the spread of these tales, no matter how exciting they may seem. The practice of discrediting the problem of unidentified flying objects and unexplained phenomena continued in the following years. For example, in December 1967, the General and Applied Physics Department of the USSR Academy of Sciences, led by academician Artsimovich, issued a decision condemning the study of UFOs in the USSR, declaring it an anti-scientific sensation. Now, at the same time, lecturers of the Moscow Planetarium, Bronstein and Shevlyakov, began to give lectures in which they declared the problem of UFOs non-existent, and the group of researchers, that is, those who studied UFOs independently, a harmful, self-styled organization. And on January 24, 1968, the chairman of the Astro Council of the Soviet Union was a member of he was a corresponding member of the Academy of Sciences USSR, Mustel, who already had curious UFO sightings, by the way. He tried to unequivocally explain that the problem of UFOs are caused by mass psychosis, reminiscent of the flu epidemic. Okay? And on 29th of February of 1968, a month before the death of Gagarin and Sirogin, in the newspaper Trud, there appeared a devastating article, "Flying Saucers Again," signed by the same member of the Soviet Academy of Sciences, Mustel, also Professor Martinov and Leshkovtsev. In the article, the problem of UFOs was called myth and conjecture, and people who took this problem seriously were declared ignorant in science. Perhaps this latest publication turned out to be a psychological obstacle that prevented the High Government Commission from crossing it after the crash that ended Gagarin and Sigirogin's existence. So they were afraid to entertain the idea that the UFO might be the cause of the incident. Even though all the data pointed to the cause of death of the first cosmonaut of the planet, Yuri Gagarin, and his instructor, Colonel Vladimir Sirogin, the coming together of the airplane with a brightly shining object, the Commission did not find the strength and opportunities or courage to admit it and openly declare it in its official conclusion. And how different it is from the same cowardly stance in the United States and other countries when it came to the UFOs and official and science, though, let's put it that way. After all, it was only 1 month after the guidance, this anti-UFO article that was put forward by Soviet scientific officials, and that's when the incident took place, 1 month later. Could the Commission go against the Academy of Sciences and the Central Committee of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, becoming among those who are ignorant in science if they admitted UFOs as the cause? In all likelihood, having come to the conclusion that there was indeed an impact on the MiG-15 UTI aircraft of an unknown flying object, the Commission decided to explain the crash by a more real cause, replacing the luminous sphere as if 1,000 suns, that's how the eyewitness described it, with the terrestrial and understandable sphere probe. Although this was, to put it mildly, a deliberate lie, it did not violate the established official scientific paradigm. Naturally, no matter how exotic the cause was, the evidence of real eyewitnesses, the Commission would have had to attest the version of the airplane's encounter with some vague glowing up sphere, which would explain many objective data. It's not unusual to take into account things we don't yet understand. It's not unusual, but you have to do it. Maybe that's why all the fragments of the aircraft were sealed in airtight barrels for eternal storage until future generations come about. What is being hidden in this case? The molten edges of the shattered fuselage, or incomprehensible marks on the right plane of the crashed aircraft? And actually, could there be a real event of the encounter of Yuri Gagarin's airplane with an unknown flying object, the existence of which was ignored in every possible way? To assert this fact, we can also cite some of the most characteristic cases inscribed in the history of UFO encounters with airplanes. But you can find them in my videos about Soviet ufology. You know what my channel is. You're watching my video now, and there must be dozens of videos where I bring forward and present to you such facts. All this may mean the only thing. It is possible that on March 27, 1968, in the air over Kirzach, there could have been a tragic encounter of the airplane Yuri Gagarin and Vladimir Serogin were on with an unknown flying object, and the Commission had no convincing grounds to ignore the testimony about the circumstances of the last minute of flight of training aircraft MiG-15 number 18. And this hypothesis, this theory about the UFO being the cause of the tragic event, it's still open. I will bring you much more information about Soviet UFO history, Russian imperial history of UFOs, and modern history as well. But what's clear is that Gagarin and Serogin died due to tragic circumstances that involved technical difficulties, bad weather, human error, or an encounter with a UFO. But secrecy exists and we don't know much. Thank you, and we'll speak again soon.